Coming up, the New York Football Giants have been hosting the Detroit Lions for some joint practices, getting out on the field, knocking helmets with real competition. We talk about the vibes for Big Blue, and there are takeaways that we can really hang our hat on as we see some competition here to go along with position battles to watch, maybe cut candidates for Detroit, and ultimately our old familiar friend, offensive line concerns. We dive in next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're both keeping cool on a hot day like today, talking about the Giants joint practice, Andy, and hopefully some takeaways that we feel like are continuing some good vibes of this offseason for the rebuilding squad.
Yeah, it's exciting. Obviously, we've gone through the rookies reporting to training camp. Then we have the rest of the team coming into training camp. We see what's happening. Obviously, now we get to see them up against real competition in the Detroit Lions. It's fascinating to me what we're seeing. And already there's some good nuggets that were a takeaway from the first day of joint practices with the Detroit Lions.
Yeah, listen, we want to get into Brian Daboll, talk about the offensive line, no JMS out there today, talk about, some of the players maybe that if we think this team still needs to improve its roster, they could keep an eye on with Detroit. But high level, I mean, what are the things that we liked? We see Daniel Jones throwing the ball around pretty good, right? Kind of a highlight catch down the sideline to Malik Nabers. He gets called out of bounds by the referees on site, but you watch the tape. He got that second foot down. And then you also see the chippiness that you want. Some squabbling and fighting, probably not the greatest thing, as there was an all-time nice little sound clip from Brian Burns when they asked about, how do you feel about Daniel Jones getting in the mix of that fight? He goes, oh, Danny in there? Well, he can back up. He can go ahead and back up. Let the other guys take care of it. But this is all part of what you want to kind of get everyone's blood flowing a little bit here in the summer.
Well, what I found fascinating is you start out with Dan Campbell being interviewed, and they ask him about how he feels about the joint practices. And Dan Campbell could not speak more highly of the Giants organization. He's like, I was here for 4 years. They gave me my first go, my first chance in the NFL. There's still people in the building from when I was here. I have the ultimate respect for Mr. Mara, who's since passed, and John Mara and the family. You got all these good vibes. It's hugs and kisses. And then when you get out on the field, clearly the players did not hear Dan Campbell or did not care about what Dan Campbell said in terms of feeling good, because there was a lot of physicality. If you look at social media, you look at a lot of the beat reporters for the Giants, but not only the beat reporter for the Giants. Sometimes I like to look on the opposite side. So Colton Pouncey is a reporter for The Athletic, follows the Detroit Lions. He literally he wrote, "This is the most physical practice I have ever seen." So like right out of the gate, Adam, the first thing that everyone says is, holy shnikes, this is different than what we saw even in any of the other practices. Jordan Renan came out and said, I've been doing this since 2013. This is easily the most physical practice I have witnessed too. Are you surprised that it got ratcheted up so fast, or was this kind of expected by you?
Well, I mean, again, first time to see other players. So this is also like, because we saw a little bit of chippiness within the Giants when they were doing their practices last week. So, okay, you can't totally go hog wild against your own teammates and guys that are on your offense or defense side of the ball. So now you bring in somebody else that when they blow up maybe one of our guys on a running play, we can go ahead and start to scrap a little bit. You also probably have enough turnover here. We talk about the offensive line, John Runyon Jr., new guy in the door, right? And I'm listing players that are not participating in full capacity, understand. But Illuminor's there as well. You get Van Roten, as we talked about him at center. You're talking about Malik Nabers, a rookie who is coming in with some bullish energy. Even guys that have been here, like Wan'Dale Robinson, like Jalen Hyatt, you want to start to go from whether you're making your first statement with the team as a rookie or as a free agent or as a player who was here a year ago and didn't have a good season as a team. You want to come out and say, hey, we're not going to be that pushover, rollover kind of team. Combine that with what the Dan Campbell energy is, as we've seen from him in press conferences and the team on the field. No, can't be surprised that it ends up being hey, we're going to go physical real quick here. And by the way, Brian Daboll likes this too. He has that kind of Dan Campbell, let's really get some helmets on helmets here and ratchet this up. So I'm not surprised that these two teams collided like this on day one.
But not only am I not surprised, this is encouraged, as you mentioned before. And the reason why is The Giants stunk last year. They
Right.
were not good. So the first time you see another team, if it's all like, let's sing Kumbaya and we'll hold hands and like, how is that preparing you for anything that's about to come in the regular season?
Of
So
course.
while we are a month and change away from real life football, it is encouraging to see last season when the Detroit Lions and Giants had joint practices, day one, the Giants were overwhelmed. The
Yeah, yeah.
Giants did not anticipate the physicality of the Detroit Lions. And so you can tell the coaching staff put an emphasis and actually called out the team. You can tell that they were way more prepared this time to say, like, hey, iron sharpens iron. We need to, be physical and don't be afraid to get into people's faces. This is not some kind of friendly, like it's international soccer. This is how are we preparing for day one NFL physical football, come September.
And by the way, as we know, year over year, it continues to move in the direction where the preseason game, which we'll have on Thursday night between these two teams, continues to matter less and less. And the joint practices are becoming more and more where you're getting in real valuable reps. So, it's funny. Someone already said this. I think a lot of people have picked up on it of, hey, you know what you should be televising is the joint practices, not the preseason games, because they're the more interesting part
I
of this.
totally agree. I
But
totally agree with that point. Why is there not a camera that like on SNY or something that is just rolling this practice?
yeah,
Don't avid Giant fans want to tune in instead of seeing these little clips like on social media? Like to me, it makes very little sense that there's not more access to like all this stuff that's going on.
this is such a side note of it, but I do believe that we are going to move towards a prime time because even the preseason games are still in prime time because you're keeping that rhythm. These practices are during the day. So is there real televised value to this if you're at work, maybe? Even though I think it's a Canadian holiday today, by the way. My girlfriend told me she has off.
Shout out to our Canadian listeners of OGP, by the way.
Exactly, yeah, because they're all off. They're all tuned in. But the idea of like a prime time practice being displayed. So it's under the lights, it's on the field. There's still all the stoppages, all the breakups, all the resets. It's going to be a lot of just this kind of vagueness around what are we running, 7-on-7s, full, all that stuff. Yeah, I think you should see that because clearly, and you're getting this from all the clips you find on Twitter, as you mentioned, like this is when things are really happening. And when you're seeing the reps for guys that you really care about, Daniel Jones, Brian Burns, all these players that when you come to Thursday night, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how does Drew Lock look as he gets the bulk of the reps, right? What did we see from fourth running back, fifth wide receiver? We're going to be focusing a lot more depth when it comes to the preseason game. The joint practices are where we actually talk about the starters we're going to see on Sundays in September.
Yeah, and Adam, so let's think about it this way. Which way do you
Okay.
want to go first in terms of who we want to highlight? Do you want to go on the offensive side of the ball or do you want to go on the defensive side of the ball?
Andy, when we come back here in just one moment and tell everybody about one of our great sponsors, we're going to focus on the offensive side of the ball first because for all the things that we know are going to happen on the defense side, and there are questions there, offensive line, Daniel Jones, and of course, Malik Nabers. These are some of the key pieces that we're going to talk about, as well as a new running game that does not have Saquon Barkley anymore. So we'll get into all of that here in just one moment. Now, as I mentioned, we've got great sponsors, and one of them is Potential, Pietential, Potential.com. It is a free online assessment tool for individual users, sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks your progress as well. It's something that I use the Giants to say, whether you're Daniel Jones coming back for injury or a rookie like Malik Nabers entering the league, it always is good to make sure you're keeping an even keel. It's also important for two hosts of a Giants podcast. We don't want to get too high or too low when we talk about a joint practice in early August for the New York Giants. So check out Potential.com today. Andy, offensively, Daniel Jones, he talked afterwards, thought the offensive line played well. He thought he needed to stand up for his guys. That's why he gets in the mix. Got to figure out how to make his eyes a little bit less wide in these post-practice interviews. But what else did you see from him in the offense?
No, he looked good. He looked confident. He looked sharp. And I saw people were asking some of the beat writers. They said Daniel Jones looked efficient. That was a word that was used. He got the ball to different playmakers like Jalen Hyatt. Obviously, we'll mention Malik Nabers shortly. Yep. But also, like people started asking, well, how did the offensive line do? And I saw, my obvious answer is, well, you already heard Daniel Jones look good. So that, to me, tells you that the offensive line was at least mediocre, right? He's getting the ball out. He's getting it to receivers. He hasn't had the time to be able to do that, even when he has been healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, obviously, it's encouraging to hear that the offensive line wasn't completely overwhelmed, unmitigated disaster right out of the gate. It's nice that Daniel Jones is being able to move the ball around the field, and the playmakers are making big plays. And even with a few, there was a moment where Daniel Jones threw a few incompletions deep, and the defense for the Lions was cheering, and they were, brash and putting their chests out. And Brian Daboll was like, again, I want you to throw it over their head again. I want you to go after the jugular here. And big plays were being made. And like you said, it's just practice. But it's encouraging that Daboll is saying, take the deep shot. We need to be able to get these explosive plays to our big playmakers like Hyatt, like Wan'Dale Robinson, like Malik Nabers. Even Theo Johnson over the middle had a couple of catches during open session. Adam, it's at least encouraging. You can't win the Super Bowl in first joint practice with the Lions, but it could be an unmitigated disaster and look the same way that it's looked for the last 3 years in terms of the offensive line play. That was not the case. That makes me at least encouraged. I hope you feel the same way.
Yeah, nothing that you do in a joint practice in August is going to add to what you accomplish in the regular season, right? But you can take away from a lot of the fan base's willingness to be excited again, willingness to support this team, to think that, hey, the over-under at 6.5 for this team is being insulting. Hey, even if we don't think Daniel Jones is the long term, he can still be a good quarterback this year. The line can play well. Malik Nabers can be a star, right? So, yes, I do agree that everything you take away from this first joint practice is like, hey, mostly positive here. Went toe-to-toe with the Detroit Lions, put some good things on tape, and obviously some things you want to carry over going forward. I also refuse, probably from too much scar tissue built up from preseasons past, where I have been one of the biggest, like, hey, look what we see here. Look how camp is going. I think this guy's going to be a real player. And then you get to the regular season, and it starts to unravel, and you get beat up, and the losses start piling up, and you realize that, hey, I still do need to see it in those first 4 games of the regular season. That being said, I do like what I've seen so far. Specifically, when we talk about the offense and Daniel Jones looking pretty good in the line, I mentioned at the top, the only thing that is, of course, going to carry forward for me here, at least right now, is when Brian Daboll says, well, it's good for Van Roten to get those reps. He has familiarity with Brasillo. It'll obviously help inform him when he gets back to guard where he's going to get those snaps. We still sit here today at this moment with JMS sidelined with injury. He had an injury last year as well, as we know, and you want that developmental process to start for him. This is a good time for JMS to be on the field, getting up against these other teams and other defensive fronts. There still is this uncertainty right now, whether it's injury or otherwise. I just want to get to that plugged in starting 5, let alone we talk a little bit about depth and who's going to be supporting these pieces. Because when you bring in a guy like Van Roten to play guard for you, and now he's playing center for you, that already tells you that there's still things that need to be addressed here over the course of this summer.
Well, what it tells me, I guess, what it tells me is a little different than everyone else. What it tells me is they need Van Roten to get into game shape as soon as humanly possible. And it doesn't matter if it's at guard or center. He just needs to get reps and get physical and be in the building. So that's what it first tells me. The second thing it tells me is they are not confident that the backup center can allow the offense to function. And
well, yes,
that's a huge concern. Like, why do we have a backup center if we can't put them out during camp to get valuable reps? What we're essentially saying is we don't have a backup center. It's Jean-Michael Schmitz, and then maybe Van Roten can do it in a pinch, and we maybe have some other people. Because, Adam, if not now, when? When are you ever going to have your backup center get reps? And so it's a concern for me. To me, it's basically like they value Van Roten getting on the field and participating more than they value their backup center getting valuable reps. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but that's the reality of what's going on in the offensive line.
No, it's a bad thing because if everything is right here and JMS gets back in at center and you have Van Roten playing at right guard and you go to the regular season with the lineup that we've talked about before, well, if it's going to be Thomas and it's going to be Runyon Jr. and JMS and then Van Roten, God, but this stupid name is going to bother me, and then Illuminor at right tackle. If that's your starting 5 you want to go into and they're all ready to walk out the door week 1, and then all of a sudden JMS goes down and now Van Roten goes over to center. Now somebody has to go to right guard. Is that going to be Illuminor? Then who goes into right tackle? It creates that carousel effect that we know we can't have. And this, by the way, on a very high level, it's not necessarily an indictment on the Giants right now in terms of how they're trying to address the offensive line, because it's hard for me to sit here and say, oh, you didn't do enough. Listen, you did go get 2 guys, and we talked about, did you get the 3rd player you could have in free agency? Should Van Roten already have been here if you clearly see this depth issue? That's certainly debatable, but they've tried their best this offseason to improve this offensive line. It is just the nature of, you do need 8 guys, not 5 guys, not 4 guys. You need 8 players where you feel confident. And we saw this a year ago with Matt Parrott, and whether or not we believe in Joshua Zudu and all these things, right? It's still very much in flux here. And it's why there is a player I want to get your thoughts, but then there's a player I want to just highlight here before we go defense that I think the Giants should keep an eye on, who is on the other side of this ball right now for Detroit.
Well, Adam, the weird thing is, we mentioned before, the Giants in the offseason signed Austin Schlottman to a 2-year,
Yes. Skinny as well.
$2.795 million contract, 500K signing bonus, 500K guaranteed, average annual salary of 1.3, almost $1.4 million.
Yeah.
And
there's a good point to bring up, Andy.
And he's not getting on the field to get reps. And we saw John Michael Schmitz got hurt last year. What happens in the regular season? Are we going to move Van Roten over and then we're going to have another carousel at guard? Like, I know that it should just be a footnote because this is just one practice and people are getting their sea legs underneath them. But it's already concerning to me. How are these guys not getting valuable reps? That to me is a little bit of a problem. Otherwise, overall on the offensive side of the football, it felt pretty good. We mentioned Daniel Jones looked efficient. He looked clean. Malik Nabers was targeted 8 times. Adam, do you know how many catches he had?
8.
Oh yeah, that would be 8. It's like, there's the one debatable one where it looks like he got his feet in bounds that the ref ruled incomplete. I mean, during camp, I'm gonna rule that a completion. So he went 8 for 8, and it's like even against other teams, he's still doing Malik Nabers type things. Like the excitement level is sky high for him. It is encouraging the way that the offense looked overall on that side of the ball. Remember, the Detroit Lions have the 4th best odds to win the Super Bowl. And while this isn't a real game, you're talking about real players, real impact players on both sides of the ball. It's at least encouraging to start training camp seeing Daniel Jones drop back and make plays to playmakers.
Yeah. Again, the world where they drop back and they keep seeing the Detroit Lions defensive players back off from slamming Daniel Jones to the ground here. That's not a great version, or where he's missing all of the deep passes, where Malik Nabers is not getting targets or getting catches. So a lot of positives here. And I think as we go forward, one of the things we're going to watch for is that running game and seeing how that's developing, because that's a whole different room now, as we very well know. The name I'm going to point out here for everybody to keep an eye on, not even in these joint practices or going to the preseason game, but keeping an eye on cut candidates for Detroit. When you look over at the Detroit Lions and their offensive line play, you already have, obviously, Sewell is going to be playing there. And then you also have rookies in Giovanni Manu and then Christian Mahogany, who are going to be likely to have, obviously, opportunities to claim roles for themselves. So a player who signed a $1 million contract in Dan Skipper to come back to this roster, who's been with this team before and who's 30 years old, suddenly becomes a guy that may not be long for their roster. And you, to use Andy's phrase, you may ask, why does it matter, Adam? Who cares about a player that's going to get cut from another roster? Well, even though he hasn't been, a perfect player by any stretch of the imagination, when you go look at some of his limited snap count stats coming over, PFF grade going to these past couple of seasons, limited. He did not qualify for these because he only played a little over 100 snaps a year ago in 11 games, though. PFF run blocking grade, 58.3. You're not going to blow anybody's skirt up with that, but 67.7 in a pass blocking grade, it certainly matters. And over the course of his career, he is a player that has a lot of reps and a lot of experience. And at 30 years old, and with a dead cap hit of 0 on a post-June 1 cut for the Lions, he's a guy you can see potentially end up on the cutting room floor. And someone, if we're talking about who's our backup swing tackle, where's our depth, it wouldn't be hard to squint and maybe see a player like that be on the Giants board, especially at an incredibly low cost.
The Giants should be looking for offensive line help anywhere they can get it. Skipper is a good name. Obviously, we're not talking about guys that are going to be key contributors for the Lions. They have arguably the best offensive line in the league. But to that point, that means that some of their depth pieces might actually be better than some of the depth pieces the Giants have. And when you're talking about your 3rd string or 4th string guard or tackle, definitely something to look out for.
100%. We're going to turn our attention over to the defensive side of the football here coming up. And when we do so, I have another name to watch for from Detroit. And this one's a lot more fun than Dan Skipper, the 30-year-old journeyman backup. We'll get into that here in just one moment. As we continue today's OGP, a little look into the joint practice with the Detroit Lions. Reminder, obviously, Thursday night, they're going to be taking them on in the preseason game. You already heard, by the way, that Daniel Jones said he'd like to play, but that is coach's decision. Let me translate that for you. He's not going to play. And you're going to see some of the backups, and that's a good thing. We're going to get maybe an extended look at Drew Lock, which is important when we know injuries are going to play a factor for the New York Football Giants. But if we turn our attention over to the defensive side of the ball, Andy, there are things coming out of this that I think are good in terms of getting Brian Burns out there and getting a sense of what this defensive front looks like. And then there's versions of it when it comes to coverage that I think we all expected to be problematic for the Giants.
Yeah, so obviously you talk about Brian Burns a little bit. He looked athletic. He looked like he was as shifty and explosive as ever. That is encouraging, especially given
Looks like he's
the
having fun.
given the compensation both monetarily in his contract and draft capital to see
Yeah.
him go up against what is considered one of the best offensive lines is encouraging. Seeing him get the right reps, being explosive, want him to stay healthy. Obviously, along the line, Jordan Riley had a couple of good reps that he was pushing forward, being really forceful up the center against Frank Ragnow, the center.
Yep.
Couple of good things in that regard. I think in the secondary you mentioned before, it's a little bit of a challenge, and obviously people like Amon-Ra St. Brown and others are explosive on the Detroit Lions. So this is one of the more difficult matchups for the Giants. But right away, you looked at Cordale Flott, who got burned a few different times, Adam, and you're worried about how this will translate to the regular season. You told me that I should not put too much into any of the stuff that we're doing. Are you already putting like a not a red flag, but like an orange flag or a yellow flag up, being like, uh-oh, if this, what does it tell you?
Yeah. So, okay. Even though I said don't put too much stock into these joint practices, but it's like talking about the offensive line, but the lack of depth there is a concern. You can see that. You want to make sure the outside cornerback spot, going back to the Hard Knocks and going back to what they wanted to do in the second round and seeing that they didn't get there and then trying to shift their roster around a little bit. Yes, I do put a little, I highlight in yellow right now, and then it elevates to orange, and then it goes to red if it looks like Cordale Flott isn't developing and getting the reps over the course of the summer. Now, remember, he's trying to work exclusively on the outside. That's going to be different for him. So I expect growing pains, and he's still a young player. But now that you drafted Drew Phillips and you like having him in there on the inside on the nickel packages, then you start thinking about Nick McLeod, who they're playing inside, but that seems kind of like a depth value. It seems kind of like you don't want to put too much in the back of Cordale Flott's mind about losing that starting role potentially. I would expect to see that shift in terms of snap counts and how they look at things if Flott continues to struggle. It's the number one question mark for me right now on the defensive side of the ball. Beyond depth and other positions and battles, who is going to be out there across from Tay Banks, and can you at least rely on it to be more often than not consistent, even if you expect there to be struggles, especially against some of the elite number two. So yeah, you have to watch Flott with kind of a critical eye here early on.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. The more you see Nick McLeod and he continues to at least perform, decently, you're going to see him get more reps. They obviously want Cordale Flott to be able to take that role and run with it. It hasn't been there yet. It's something to look out for. But to your point, with the way the draft board fell, the Giants ended up with Drew Phillips as opposed to an outside corner. And Drew Phillips actually had a good day. He really got up in the face, was ultra physical with Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was part of the reason why one of the, 675,000 fights that they had today occurred, because he was really physical with Amon-Ra St. Brown. And so for me, like, that's his calling card. He always says, I'm not going to be scared of anyone. That's what he said in Hard Knocks. It's ringing true now. The way that he gets on the field is being that ultra physical guy that people just don't want to get hit by. And you can already start seeing he wants that contact. He's not going to shy away from it, even for a guy that's a Pro Bowler or all pro caliber type player in Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah, I want to focus in on that too, because you mentioned, I mentioned, you said Nick McLeod here. Where is I'll put it back to you. Where's your concern level about organizationally the plan here if Cordale Flott struggles, and then you think about where's the best value for these guys? Well, now all of a sudden you're basically shoving all of them into that nickel package room in the inside corner slot spot. Okay, so does that mean that we're going out to market to bring in an outside corner? What's that cost going to look like? I've heard people throw out a lot of names. The Giants have $11 million in cap space right now. You need to have some of it to go into the season. I don't know who that player is going to be. We've even heard fans say, bring back Adoree Jackson. Why does it feel like the bridge has been burned so badly that you can't return him? He had a bad year last season, but his body of work in totality, if there's something left in the tank there, where would you go? Where would you go, and where's the concern level in terms of the operational steps to get to this point where we're looking here and saying, do we have any depth on the outside if it doesn't work out with Cordale Flott?
So I keep going back to taking a different area and trying to use that capital that you have and be able to potentially make a trade.
Yep.
A guy that you're like, well, I could get 85% of the value from the guy that's right behind him if we trade this guy, and we can kind of shift assets and capital over to the outside corner position. I know it's going to feel like I'm just harping on this so much, but I look at Azeez Ojulari in the last year of his contract. There's a lot of this coming out of camp where he's like, I promise I'm going to be healthy. I promise I'm going to be as explosive as you expect me to be. It just so happens that Azeez Ojulari is also in a contract year, Adam. And so if even if he does fairly well, he's going to get a contract from someone else on the open market that the Giants have no chance in matching, given that they just paid Brian Burns and they have to pay Kayvon Thibodeau. So for me, if you can get something for Azeez Ojulari and Boogie Basham or Ryder Anderson or someone else can give you that rotational, action at that edge rushing outside corner, outside linebacker position, and you can rotate that into a cornerback 3 on another team that says, hey, we really need someone that can get after the quarterback a little bit. To me, that's the best reallocation of assets for the Giants. But I know you're probably going to think I'm just being a hater on Azeez Ojulari, but that's where my head goes to solve the outside corner position.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I am not against what you speak to about converting the value. I think that's two separate things, right? And we've already seen it. Everybody over on YouTube, they are, and listen, I take no pleasure in it. I mean, I laugh in my own private moments. The way the fan base is responding to Andy's, as we now all collectively have said, this is Andy's hill that he is dying on, that Azeez Ojulari will not be on this team. Now, he's made some amendments, although some fans are documenting that he said, no, he will be cut, but also maybe via trade. And I think there's a part of me that says, yes, if you can go and accomplish that, that's great. Maybe the problem here, though, for me is what team is going to look at Azeez Ojulari? Now, you said a third cornerback on a roster. I mean, you might have to go to a fourth cornerback, right? The second outside cornerback across from the starter on their depth chart to see a value, because any other team is also going to look at the same way. Do we plan on re-signing Azeez Ojulari? Do we think he's going to be healthy for us when he hasn't been able to be healthy for the Giants? So I think all those same questions are going to come up, but no matter what you do have to look at this roster and say, how do we allocate a little bit more funds here? How do we find a way to maybe give ourselves the flexibility to go do it? There's still some restructures that could happen for this roster as well. I still, at least for now, stand on that Azeez is going to be here going into the season. And this is more of a, how is the season going? Where is his role and value? And is there something that we want to do when we get to the deadline? But it's Azeez Ojulari or 7 other guys on the roster. There's plenty of names to look at here and say, like, hey, do we need to cut or move on from this player in some form or fashion to create the space to make a clear area of weakness stronger? And that being said, I give Cordale Flott another joint practice tomorrow and the rest of this week and the preseason game and another week, right? Like, my alarm bells on the secondary will not officially sound probably until we're in the last week of training camp, last week of summer, going towards the start of the season and looking and saying, did we not get anything out of anybody, right? Are we still asking the same questions? That's when you get real concerned. And on a little positive here, as Emery Hunt for CBS Sports was reporting, you also had a guy like Isaiah Simmons looking good out there in coverage. And for me, that being the biggest area of weakness maybe in his game, with that athletic as he is, hey, I'll take that positive where I can get it and feel like the Giants have added or brought back some weapons, some athletic weapons that can move around back there.
Yeah, and Emery Hunt, I was following him along too, Adam. Great minds think alike. Someone asked him the question of, well, who won the joint practice today? Because there's no scoreboard up there. Yeah. And he said, I would pretty much call it a stalemate. It felt like both teams were pretty efficient and they did what they needed to do. That's a win for the Giants. If you're saying that it was even and you're like, both sides look great, like couldn't really tell who was wearing what jersey, I'm like, that sounds like a win to me in terms of joint practices. But to your point, let's not get over our skis. There's a whole nother practice. There's also a whole game where we're going to see a lot of these players. Isaiah Hodgins, Isaiah Simmons are 2 guys that I'm really curious to see how much playing time they will get in the preseason game, if they get any at all. But there's certainly a lot of guys that we're still waiting to see, like, what it looks like on the New York Giants.
Of course. And one last player that I wanted to mention here to keep your eye on throughout this week. I mentioned before about skipper, veteran, offensive lineman. Another veteran, linebacker, which I think is an area to pay attention to here in terms of depth as well and some moving pieces, is a player who has experience over in Kansas City, played also in Arizona and then Denver this past season. And that's going to be Ben Neiman, who, again, this is where when you look around the league, you're just looking for teams that have too much depth and maybe too much value. And he signed an under $1 million contract. It has no dead cap hit if they cut him. And when you have these other players around them, sometimes it's easy to maybe see a path where this player ends up on the cut. Now, notably, I think he ended up in Detroit via a coaching recommendation who has ties to Dan Campbell or has ties to the linebacking coach in Detroit. So there's these things that feel like they're weaving together where he's a good, veteran, respected player in the locker room. But just 2 years ago, he didn't miss a snap over, and it was only over 484. He wasn't a full-time starter, but when given the opportunity, he went out and played 249 coverage snaps and 195 snaps against the run. He ended up finishing with a 71 overall grade per PFF. Take it for what it's worth, right? 70 combined tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and a quarterback hit en route to finishing, obviously, with a pretty strong grade out. But he's still just a depth piece. For Detroit, he represents a guy who may only see the field for 200 to 250 snaps, if that. For the Giants, yeah, we like Diontae Johnson, what he's been showing off, but we also need to make sure we have enough pieces there. He becomes a really interesting player to me when you go back and look at some of his stats over a successful career, 27, 28 years old.
We have talked about before the Giants' need for linebacking depth. So that's a spot-on assessment of where the Giants should be looking. Obviously, we would love a cornerback that could start right away. I don't think anybody's just going to be releasing those. They don't just grow on trees. Obviously, it's been a tough sledding for the Giants to find one of those. But a rotational linebacker that can provide a depth piece, maybe as your third or fourth or even fifth linebacker. We're talking about, we hope Micah McFadden is back healthy. You have Bobby Okereke. We talked about Diontae Johnson looking good. Carter Coughlin is also a guy that has really good special teams value, can fill in a pinch. But there's still definitely some room there for the Giants to add a piece. That's a great call out, especially when you look at a team like the Detroit Lions as a prime example.
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier, right? Fourth best percentage chance to win the Super Bowl odds, excuse me. When you got those kind of odds, it's not because your team has a lot of holes they need to fill. They're just trying to tweak and calibrate themselves a little bit. And I will just drop this in the hat that if the Giants were having the conversations about Azeez Ojulari, it's like the Detroit Lions are also the kind of team, or a team with real aspirations. You go, hey, he may not see the field a lot for you, but he may be insanely valuable because you have every other piece lined up. It's not unlike when you look at the way he could be used for the Giants right now, but where's the Giants' expectations? Where are they when they get to the deadline? So always things to watch for here. At the end of the day. Yeah, no, go ahead. Ooh.
At the end of the day, Adam, don't be surprised if at some point the Giants and the Lions do make a trade. There's a lot to be said about these teams seeing each other. They get to see a guy in person. They talk about the needs of each of the teams. They get firsthand knowledge of these players. They get to see the impact. And if Azeez Ojulari, he's just one example, but Jordan Riley looked great. There's a ton of guys that are showing flashes that, Detroit Lions may not have the scar tissue of having the guy being often injured or not being available or not on the field. They just see him explosive in a few plays and like, man, if we could get him for one of our backup rotational pieces, that's a no-brainer. And so there's a lot of this that happens between the joint practices. The GMs talk, the coaches talk. Don't be surprised if one of these players on the Detroit Lions ends up being on the Giants' 53-man roster.
And not to get so zeroed in on Azeez as we talk about it, Darius Slayton. I think that he's a prime example for teams that have established hierarchy of wide receiver talent, but want to continue to expand it and make it more explosive. What an easy veteran to bring in. I keep telling this to everybody. It's like, go back and look at the stats. I saw in a Giants chat talking about what are the expectations for Malik Nabers? Well, maybe he'll get to 1,000 yards. I've got a guy clearing 750 year over year. He had Daniel Jones, Tyrod Taylor, and Tommy DeVito throwing to a year ago. You tell me you got Jared Goff ready to sling it and you just want to add more firepower. There's always opportunities. Obviously, money's going to play a big factor, but that's what's fun about these. And a really good point you bring up, Andy. When you see these teams and when you watch Hard Knocks, turns out a lot of deals get done by two GMs standing on the sideline going, oh, what do you got over there? Oh, you think you might want to make a little deal with me over here? Hey, it's just me, Joey Shane, hanging out on a summer's eve. So
just some guys having some fun, maybe some jokes, but not really. Let me know if you're interested. What was that draft pick? I'll call you later.
Yeah, let me my people call your people. So it's all good stuff. By and large, you mentioned Paul Dottino echoed a draw in terms of result of this practice. That's a good thing because while, again, you cannot win regular season games in a joint practice, you can really lose in terms of making your fan base excited about what you have on the field. So it looks like the Giants are trying to turn that page from a year ago and turn that corner in terms of the energy they bring. So really exciting to see this team get out there and bang hats a little bit. I'll remind you that this episode was also brought to you by Personam, which is an AI cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms just can't do. Personam's always vigilant and always learning, Andy. It looked like you have one more nugget, though, before we go.
All I was going to say is what I'm going to be looking out for in camp tomorrow is reaffirming the things that we think are true and finding out if they are true. That's always what this is, what this is, in a good way or a bad way. If we continue to see that the cornerback number 2 spot is getting burned constantly, it reaffirms that we definitely need help. If the offensive line holds, ends up holding up pretty good. We're like, wow, some of the offseason acquisitions may be helping this offensive line. I just want to reaffirm the things that I think. If something else happens where, Malik Nabers drops 3 passes, that seems to me like a one-off that you kind of push off to the side because it hasn't happened so far. Reaffirm the things that you think and then make the decisions accordingly from there.
2 centers brought in, obviously, behind John Michael Schmitz. They did not get the start. It was obviously the man who just signed the contract in Van Roten. And then you also have, apparently, Andy, 8, maybe even 9 guards on this roster right now. Where the heck are all of them? Let's see some reps from what are supposed to be quality backups. Let's thin out that herd. Guys, we're going to be back in all this week long. More conversations about what we take away from these joint practices. Really fun, really exciting. And we are trying to line up a crossover with some coverage of the Detroit Lions to get down into the details of what we think is possible in terms of cut candidates and takeaways from these practices from the other side. So be sure to be tuned in for that. Get us on YouTube. Get us on the podcast feed. Support the sponsors if you dare. Until next time. Until the best times. As Andrew Mackless would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.